this is a story of my mother's family, which took shape as a result of the research. It began soon after my father's death in the late 1970s. Growing up in a segregated, protected, and very supportive middle-class African-American community in Washington, D.C., I thought very little about our family origins, and I mean very little. There was minimal discussion about the matter, and except for my mother's stories about her mother and an occasional reference to my father's mother, there was nothing, virtually nothing. I never knew my grandparents, all of whom had died before my birth or soon after. A fact that I fleetingly regretted whenever my friends spoke glowingly of the attention and support they received from their grandparents. I think I had several friends whose grandmothers lived in their homes. I remember that very well. Since my parents had left their extended families behind in Louisiana, in their search for a better life in Washington, D.C., I did not know these family members very well. My mother had died at age 45 when I was 16 years old. But it was when my father died at age 88 and a half, and I myself was well in middle age, that I got curious about my family origins. I had wondered how a family that had been as impoverished as my father described his to have been. He told of toiling in the bayous, harvesting rice, and battling snakes in the swamps. I remember him saying he would look up and see the train go by, and he'd say, if I can get on that train and get out of here, I will never, ever come back. And he literally, nearly did that. He would send us back, but he would not return. But I wondered how such a family could produce the bevy of high achievers that they did. He became a dentist, and among his siblings there were a physician, a pharmacist, who was also a very successful businessman, a nurse, and an undercover agent who was seen by the family as a stool pigeon. He was a scapegoat in the family. But it was later revealed that this man who worked for the FBI had conducted some heroic acts, but he couldn't tell the family. However, I was really even more curious about my mother's family, but for reasons that will become clear, I could not let even myself know this. As I began the search for my father in my father's family, I ran into the barriers researching his line prior to 1880. We couldn't find them. They were from St. Charles Parish. But the search concerning my mother's family, which I turned to, produced a very different result. There were a series of breakthroughs that have had a profound influence upon my life. Now, if there's someone who can turn, are we going to be able to see the slides? Perhaps I'd better first, I want to show the genogram. You can see that, and you can also look at it, so we can leave the lights on. Don't turn the lights off yet. Prior to the research undertaking, I knew the following facts about my mother's family. My mother, whose name was Olli Bourgeois, was the granddaughter of Letty Bibbs Robertson, who had been born a slave. I knew great-grandma Letty, having seen her on several occasions, briefly, not for very long, when I visited Louisiana as a child. I also knew my mother's brother, Henry, and her sister, Coralie. Their mother, Cecilia, my grandmother, for whom my own sister was named, and whose last name I never knew until I did the research, had died when my mother was 16. So she died when my mother was 16, and my mother died when I was 16. Mother had mentioned the death of her mother many times, and always with great sadness. As I stated, and I repeat that. Although my mother carried her father's name Bourgeois, which I often wrote on documents when asked to give mother's maiden name, I knew nothing else about her father, and though curious, I never dared ask. It is important for me to point out that this side of the family was, for me, shrouded in shame. I knew this was somehow connected with my mother's name and her appearance, which I suspected was related to the fact that her father had been a white man and that her parents had not been married. And for those of you who are young in this audience, it was shameful if people weren't married. Hard to believe that now. I did not learn her father's name until I began the research activity and procured a copy of my mother's death certificate. His name was Adolf, which was not a very happy thought for me, the name of Adolf having very negative connotations for us all. Mother had refused to discuss her father, and a latent message was always given that the subject was shameful and unmentionable. As I began the research activity, I also learned that my maternal grandmother's last name had been Turo, and that she had also been fathered by a white man, whose name she bore. Even though I was then a middle-aged woman seeking to understand these family secrets, some members of the family were reluctant to discuss these issues. And I must say that one family member, although I think he was reluctant, helped me unbelievably to do this work, and that was my mother's brother, Henry, and some of his family is here today. I knew he didn't want me to know some things, but he was there rooting for me and told me many things that I did not know about my mother. In addition to great-grandmother Letty, I had also known her second husband, Frank Robertson, and heard stories about the warmth and caring of her first husband, Alec Bibbs, who, along with many other family members, had helped to raise my mother. Mahalie Landry, who was my grandmother's older sister, whom I then learned had also been named for her white father, and Carrie Bibbs, Alec's daughter. I also knew her. In addition, Mahalie, like her younger sister Cecilia, my grandmother, also had a daughter, Mamie Armitage, by a white man. So here were 4 examples in this family of women who had had babies by white men for whom they named their children. And this was unmentionable. Nobody ever talked about it. As a girl, I had, along with my mother and sister, visited Live Oak and St. James Parish, the farm on which Letty's family had lived for 2 generations. Live Oak burned down in a tragic fire, and the family, when I was 11 years old, and the family was then forced to move to New Orleans, living with friends and other relatives and receiving public assistance because they couldn't get insurance. So here was a healthy, thriving black family that then was reduced to being on welfare because they couldn't get insurance, and they then became destitute as a result of the fire. Just prior to the beginning of the research, I also learned that great-grandma Letty had a sister whose name was Cecilia Grigsby. Now, that was the first time that I knew that the name Cecilia, which my grandmother bore, was also a name that had been in the family another generation back. Mother never mentioned it, and we never talked about it. Cecilia Grigsby's grandchildren had information about her and Letty when they were children and slaves. Whereas I knew only these few facts about my mother's family and saw them rarely, I knew my father's family well. Perhaps because they were more affluent and often traveled from Louisiana to D.C. where we lived, and there were many visits between us. I recently recalled something I'd quite forgotten, a certain pride and even arrogance, I guess you'd say, about the family and their achievements. When my father's two brothers would visit, and the phone would ring and people would say, I want to speak to Dr. Brazier, we would say, which one? There are three here. By contrast, most of the individuals in my mother's family, except, as I said, for her brother and her sister, I knew very little. And I did not know them well until actually I was probably in college. So now I want to show you the pictures of these family members, and I think, can we see the pictures with the light on? Who's going to do the slides? Amy? Where's Amy? Oh, who's doing where? She's doing it. Okay, good. All right, this is Great Grandma Letty. It's an old snap and it's torn. It looks raggedy, and it was about all that we could get. But that gives you a picture of her. She was an old feisty lady, and I was afraid of her. She was a very tough lady. She smoked a pipe. Okay. The next slide. Now this is Cecilia Turo, my grandmother, whom I never knew, whom my mother talked about very sadly, and who, she looks a little sad. Next picture. This is Cecilia Turo's sister Carrie, which is my great-grandmother's daughter by her black husband. So we begin to see the complexities in the family. Next slide. This is Olli Bourgeois, my mother. And as you can see, she was a beautiful woman, and this was a major problem for me growing up. That's her sister, Coralie, who was Cecilia Turo's daughter by her black husband. And this is my father, and I just put him there because he was a very important person in my life. Okay, now we can have the lights on, and we're going to turn them off again when I show some other slides. I began by trying to locate Great Grandma Letty and her family in the census records. I started with the census of 1900 and 1880 because that was the earliest period in which I could locate her. And I prepared myself that I wouldn't be able to trace her further back than 1870 because census records before emancipation did not record slaves as people, only numbers. During slavery, slaves had no identity except as property of the master. Thus, the census records before 1870 listed slaves not by name but by number under the slave owner's name. Now, I'm going to quickly, I'll show you on the slide. That first document on the left is a census, the census of 1860. As you can see, there are no names there except the slave owners at the top, underlined in red, and the rest are numbers and about the slaves. Now, I particularly chose that census sheet because those slave owners are named Turo and Landry, two names that are in the family. Legal documents, records of all kinds were connected with the owner, not with the individual slave. It was only in slave sale deeds and wills that the slave owner, wills of the slave owner, that slaves were identified by name. Thus, to trace a black family before 1870, when the forebears were enslaved, it was critical to identify the slave owner. To locate Great Grandma Letty before emancipation and trace her origin, then, I had to find who owned her. Without some documented confirmation of her prior existence, the search would end before it even began. The task of finding Great-Grandma Letty's slave owner involved 4.5 weeks of work. And I want to say that I was very lucky to do this work in Louisiana. I don't know if you know that the records here are probably as good as anywhere in this country. And the reason for that is the Catholic Church, because the Church insisted that good records be kept. And that somehow, I think, influenced even the public vital statistics. So that is something that people in Louisiana should know. So I hypothesized that if I found Great-Grandma Letty's maiden name, that would be a clue to her owner, because surely she might have taken the slave owner's name. So I sought her marriage license, her death certificate, her baptismal record, and information from persons in St. James who knew her, and I did meet people there who remembered her. This was in 1977 when I did this work, and there was a woman there who was 100 who remembered the family, and well, she said. Anyway, and she told me some things, so you know. I spent over 50 hours just reading census records in the National Archives at the beginning of the research activity. That was in Washington. I read books about slavery in Louisiana in general, and in St. James in particular. I studied the records of the White, Turod, Landry, and Bourgeois families, hoping to find one member as her owner. I traveled to cemeteries only to find records were burned up, fought with clerks in the Bureau of Vital Statistics here in New Orleans regarding the existence of death certificates I knew were on file here, but they said were not. After 2 skirmishes with the Vital Statistic Office, Letty's death certificate was located when a librarian in the New Orleans Public Library found in the basement archives an undertaker's record book which listed a Letty Robinson as age 74. Well, I started to discount this because Letty, I knew, was nearly 100 when she died, but it turned out that that was in fact her death certificate, and she was passing for 74 because of insurance. If the insurance, if they had known how old she was when she bought that insurance, she would never have gotten it. So on a hunch, I sent for the record, and sure enough, it was Letty's, and that data is here, and I'm going to show it to you on slides, but you will also be able to see it in reality because it's over there on the table. My search also took me to, not just to the New Orleans Public Library, to Dillard University, to the Louisiana State Library, and I have many times said that the people there were of immeasurable help. I was really stunned in 1977 that white people were so willing to help an African American trace her family, no matter where it led, but they were indeed. And also Louisiana State, and also the New Orleans Public Library, and then there was, well, those were the libraries. I studied the private papers of the Turod and Bourgeois families at LSU. I did title searches of property and slaves in the courthouses in St. James Parish, Natchez, Mississippi, and Woodville, Mississippi, and you'll hear why I did that. Most of this activity was directed to finding Letty's slave owner. The 4.5 weeks required to trace one generation into slavery may be compared with the 1 hour it took to trace the white bourgeois line back 5 generations to 1719 in the Catholic Life Center in Baton Rouge. Okay, let's have the lights off again, and let's look at the slides just so you can have a picture of what I'm talking about. That's my mother's death certificate, and there it lists her father's name. The family members knew it, but they weren't telling me, so I had to find it myself. Okay, and it was signed by her sister Coralie. And she was saying she didn't know anything about anything. Okay, let's have the next slide. This is the census of 1880, which is the first one I found. And here is the family right here, where that says Alexander Bebe. That's really Alec Bibbs. They were French, and then they became English. So Alexander Bebe, Mahaley Landry, and Letty, that's Letty, and Mahaley Landry, Cecilia Turo, that's my grandmother. And there's a woman there by the name of Sarah Clanton, and it says that she is a mother. And I decided that she was Alexander Bebe's mother because I'd never heard of anybody named Sarah in the family. But there they were in 1880. I found them. Next slide. Oh, this is up close. You can see it better here. I don't know if you can, but anyway, that's the same data. Next slide. Is that 1900? I'm not, yes. And it's right here. You can't see it. I think there'll be a closer one, but there they are right there. Now we have Alec Bibbs. He's become English. And she's calling herself Lydia now instead of Letty. And she's with her daughter, Carrie. And my mother is there, Olli Bourgeois. It's misspelled, but that's her name, and she's there. Next slide. And this is these are the signatures on the deed of Live Oak. Live Oak is the property that they had. It was purchased in 1871 by 10 families. It was a cooperative. And over the years, several families sold out so that only 4 families still own it. It's listed under in the title of the first owner, Charles Allen. But as you see, Alec Bibbs was an owner, and it still literally belongs to 4 families, but because of the complication of no wills and whatnot, I believe that the people who are paying the taxes, the descendants of Charles Allen, are the legal owners. But that's a deed to the property, and that's 6 years out of slavery that they bought this property as a cooperative. Okay, next slide. This is Letty's marriage license in 1875, and those people who were attendants, I thought maybe they were clues to the slave owner, but that led nowhere. Okay, next slide. That's her death certificate, and that's where I learned what her mother's name was. That her mother's name was Sarah, and the woman in the census was really my great-great-grandmother. So I found that out. And Coralie signed it again, although she didn't know anything. Next slide. And this is the breakthrough slide. This is the census of 1870. And what you see here, Sarah Clouden, my great-great-grandmother, listed with Letty, her daughter, and Letty's daughter, Mahaley. But it's the breakthrough slide because listed above them is a wealthy sugar planter by the name of Burgundy Lapisse. And I didn't really know that that was the clue I needed for a while. But when I finally put it together, and you can show the next slide. That's it up close. I don't know if you still can't see it very well. We're right here. And see, that says Burgundy Lapisse and Lapisse's family. I went to the courthouse in St. James Parish and looked up all of the property of the Lapisse family, and I found a slave document in 1855 listing a Letty, a Cecilia, and a Sarah of the right ages. So I had then found the slave owner, and then I could go back and I could trace from whom did Lapisse get the slaves. And I actually went back 2 owners to 1833. And next slide. Oh, that is the 1860 census up close. The one I said was just two slave owners, and the slaves were listed as people. Next slide. This is the 1855 document, and that's my writing there, where I put that they were on the slave document. Next slide. Next slide. This is just a part of the slave document. Now this is the slave document of 1837, where I found Sarah. Now there's no Letty because she hasn't been born yet, but Sarah with her family, including her mother. So now I have found my great-great-great-grandmother, who was born in 1792. Next slide. Next one. This is just how they listed them. You see they listed them with family groups, one family. And you see the columns, the ages, and then there's description of them, remarks, description of them, how many bales of cotton they could pick, and how much they were sold for. You see that the final column is how much they were sold for. Next slide. And this is my great-great-great-grandmother, Eliza Scott. She had a family with Nancy, Sarah, Henry, Matilda, and Ennis. Now, I never heard of these people. I never even heard of Sarah. So I never heard of these people. And the column lists them as mulattoes and lists how much money they cost, and what's off the wall, I mean, how many bales of cotton they could pick, and off the wall is how much they were sold for. I think Eliza was sold for $1,000 and Sarah for $1,500 or something like that. Okay, let's see, is there another slide to this? This is a newspaper article on the Lapis family that owned the slaves. And it says that Burgundy Lapis was the son of Pierre Lapis, who was in the court of Louis XIV. And Louis XIV deeded the land to the Lapis when the Louisiana Purchase opened up, and people came to settle in Louisiana. Now, what I found, however, is that my family came into the South, did not come in the South to the South from the port of New Orleans. The slaves must have come from, Eliza Scott was brought from Virginia by a slave owner, the one that owned her in 1833, brought her down from Virginia when there was an agricultural disaster in Virginia and Maryland. A lot of slave owners left and brought their families, their property, their cattle, and their slaves. And they brought them all down to settle in this territory. And that is how they came to be, first in Mississippi, and then they were sold into Louisiana. But this is about Burgundy, Pierre Lapis, who was chased out of Haiti when Toussaint Louverture led that revolution. He had to leave Haiti, and that's when he came to Louisiana to enslave my family. Okay, or to be the third slave owner of the family. Okay, I think that's all the slides, so we can have the lights on now. And I want to say that all of that information that I've just shown you on slides is there for you to see. You can see the actual documents. But now I want to talk about what does it mean to have done this work, and what does this information, what do I make of this? In summary, these practices in which there was minimal support and assistance for blacks from a few whites, and in which there was domination, exploitation, and abandonment of blacks by many more whites, massively influenced the psychology, personality development, and interracial behavior of all involved. A major effect for blacks has been the fragmentation of identity, which this research sought to address and to correct. So the next level of discussion is about the family. Restoring the family and placing it in the context of the times my ancestors lived facilitated my awareness of the cutoffs, secrets, fusion, and confusion created by racism. As a child, as I've said, I perceived my mother's family as having shameful secrets. I now understand that the abandonment by the white fathers, plus the poverty and desperation that followed the fire at Live Oak, were so painful to my mother as to preclude their examination. I don't know if I mentioned that Live Oak did burn down. Yeah. As stated, I never knew my white grandfather's first name, and though curious, I wouldn't ask. I have learned through this research that there was much to be proud of about my mother's family. They were hardworking people with a strong sense of responsibility. As I said, Alec Bibbs bought Live Oak, which still belongs to the original owners, in 1871. The household has been described by family members as and neighbors as well organized, and the farm is flourishing. Although life was harsh, there was much love, abundance, and pleasure for these resourceful and competent people. Stories were told of the efficiency of the farm with its variety of crops and livestock, of the warmth and good times, as well as hard times, that the family shared in the big old house with a veranda that encircled its girth. And it was a large house, and this porch went all the way around it. Letty herself was described as hardworking and competent, and her daughter Carrie's wedding in 1906 to a young minister was recalled by neighbors, now quite old, as an exciting event. Live Oak was discovered to be, as I said, part of a cooperative of 10 families. There were recollections of the sharing that had characterized neighborly as well as family interaction. So we're talking about a very supportive community here that people had created. Well documented is the support extended between neighbors and family members in relation to raising the children. When the white fathers remained irresponsible and abandoning, family members loved and cared for these children. When Cecilia, my grandmother, died, my mother was a young teenager, nurturance and protection were provided by others in the family. When a fire destroyed Live Oak in 1935, everyone rallied. There was strength and endurance in the dedication to keep the extended family together, in the courage to name the children for their fathers, no matter who they were, in the zest for life and the strong religious beliefs. I found myself remembering many things I had forgotten about my visits to Live Oak. Memories of the pleasant gatherings in the evenings on the few occasions when my mother, my sister, and I had visited. Being taken for horseback and buggy rides, being loved and cared about by these gentle, caring people, the feeling of togetherness and enjoyment of one another. I see this now in great contrast to the more lonely, isolated existence of our nuclear family in D.C. And I understand better my mother's eternal depression and her longing for home, which she frequently shared with me. I've often said that she was my first client because she shared her sadness, and I listened. There was in her family humor, loyalty, and a sense of working together, which she greatly missed. Also, the family evidenced dedication to improving the quality of life for its members. While Letty and Mahaley were laborers, they farmed and cut sugarcane. Carrie and Olli were educated to be teachers. In exposing the family secrets and in confronting the shame entrapping the family, I have also come to understand how the pain and humiliation of slavery and the sexual exploitation of women was such that the family went to great lengths not to discuss it. But I've come to understand that in trying to build a better life and attempting to forget the past, their defensive behavior has only reinforced the secrets, rigidified costly emotional cutoffs, and fragmented personal and group identity, creating for individuals within the family what has been called a non-authentic sense of self. Undoing the secrets and facing the shame, which the family had struggled to avoid, has opened up the emotional cutoff, freeing family members from these negative consequences. Discovering the pride and love that I had felt for this part of my family, which I had repressed in order to cope with the emotional pain, has become an expansive experience for me, and I value greatly having learned about their legacy of strength and endurance. Now I get a little more personal about what does it mean. I talk about how the family adapted to racism. Racism is defined as behavior both individual and institutional, which is based on the belief in the superiority of one group of people and the inferiority of another because of national and ethnic origins. I have come to see how family research can document some of the ways that Black people have responded to the racism that has existed in this country and has so dominated their environment. The slaves, when brought to this country from Africa, were forced to deal with powerful attributions by white, such as being lazy, dumb, evil, sexual, dirty, etc. While some who manifested these behaviors were playing a role to trick or placate the slave owner, others really did internalize these behaviors, which came to define who they were. Probably those slaves feeling the most powerless assumed these behaviors to the greatest extent in an effort to turn their painful sense of powerlessness into some sense of power and initiative. For example, I have elsewhere illustrated how individuals assume behaviors such as being a super stud, being super manipulative, being super resistant, or use oppositional behavior as a way of counteracting a sense of powerlessness and convey some sense of control. Now, these are behaviors that we clinicians tend to diagnose as pathological, and I've talked about the fact that they can be understood as responses to powerlessness and attempts to get some sense of power. Yet others reacted to their slave roles by identifying with the aggressor, by assuming the values of the slave master as superior, entitled, and super competent. This is a somewhat paradoxical stance and also somewhat crazy-making, in that individuals who belong to a group relegated to inferior status are striving to perceive themselves as superior. But I believe that this strategy, and my apologies to the family, because I don't know if you've heard this, I believe that this strategy was the family solution, and it evidenced itself in a kind of elitism that I discovered spanned the generations, embracing me also. I also considered how sensitivity to elitism among African Americans had more than once caused me pain when I and my family had been seen by others as stuck up. I have always been uncomfortable with an elitist stance within myself that people have mentioned, which I've known distanced me from some people. Especially when I was young, I found that at a time when I would least expect it, I had offended someone with behavior he or she had perceived as hurtful, but I hadn't been aware of it. I was always disturbed by this, for it was never conscious or deliberate, and I worked hard to cope with this tendency in myself. Until I researched my family history, I had attributed it entirely to growing up in Washington, D.C., being the daughter of a well-known dentist and attending Dunbar High School, the breeding ground of the Black elite. You know, Dunbar's graduates include such achievers as Charles Drew, William Hastie, Robert Weaver, Edward Brooke, etc. However, understanding my family history has put me in touch with a more fundamental basis of elitism as a response to racism. The story has an ironic twist because, as discussed earlier, my mother's family was a part of the family of which I was ashamed. True, as I said, I have come to view this family connection as a source of pride, but it was also clear that these strong, courageous, loving people were themselves racist and elitist, sometimes hating their blackness, loving whiteness, and feeling superior to other blacks. The first clue that came up in the research was the fact that, as great-grandma Letty's sister's grandchildren said, they were, quote, house niggers and mammies. And as they said, their mother and Letty were, according to them, well treated. They told a story that their grandmother told that after the master's family ate, then the house niggers, mostly all light-skinned, were allowed to have the pickings, whereas any dark-skinned ones were not. Now, this is the story they told. Cecilia was remembered as loyal and very protective of her white employers, to whom she remained close and to whom she once claimed to be related. She protected their secrets, ran to them when angered by her family, and seemed, quote, to love them more than she did us, one of her grandchildren sadly stated. That a black child whose parents' job it is or was to care for the children of white employers could possess such a perception is not rare. In my practice, I can recall 2 clients whose memories of maternal deprivation were connected with feelings that mother was loving, more loving and accepting of her white charges than of her own children. In fact, I heard a very rancorous debate in the American Psychiatric Association annual meeting about 15 years ago on some research done with women who had raised white children. And there was this finding that they were more permissive with their white charges than they were with their own children. Now, I'm sure that there were good reasons for that. These were facts. But it was so painful to hear that these psychiatrists were actually in a battle about the findings. The second clue about this elitism concerns the issue of skin color. Letty, I was told by one of her great-grandchildren, had definite preferences based on skin color. They knew her well, and they told of how she discouraged them from playing with dark-skinned children. And I pondered how she had learned the lessons of the big house well. Irrespective of the circumstances surrounding the origin of Mahalia and Cecilia, her daughters, her 2 biracial daughters, it appears that she probably highly valued their appearance. The third clue was the discovery that Eliza Scott, Letty's grandmother, my great-great-great-grandmother, had been identified in the slave document as a mulatto and a seamstress. And that was pretty powerful to find that in 1792, there was already a mixture that they had already, so how far back this went, I don't know. But she was not only a mulatto, but she was listed as a seamstress, 2 characteristics that may have caused the family to regard themselves as special in these days. Indeed, on my visit back to St. James Parish, and during my contact with neighbors still there was a woman named Miss Lavinia. I took my Aunt Coralie back to visit, and Miss Lavinia had been a playmate of hers, and I heard her talking with Coralie, and I heard her saying, that family thought they were so much, but look at me, I'm doing as well as you. Her son had been very prosperous, and he had helped her, and I heard that. Another possible clue of such a response were the attributions to the slave owner himself. In my readings on plantation life in St. James Parish, during and immediately following slavery, I became aware of the sense of connection, both in history and in attitude, which many people entertained in relation to French royalty and privilege. It was in all of the literature how glorious the days were of plantation times and how beautiful the life was, and etc. Pierre Lapisse, the owner of Letty Cecilia and their mother Sarah, actually was the son of a nobleman in the court of Louis XIV. Archibald Dunbar, from whom Lapisse purchased Sarah, her siblings, and their mother, Eliza Scott, was the son of Sir William Dunbar of Adams County, Mississippi. James Poindexter, the owner of Eliza, who we believe brought her to Mississippi from Virginia, had been the governor of Mississippi. Here is ample evidence for such expectations of entitlements. Historians and others have pointed out how the identity and self-worth of slaves were often tied up with that of their masters, those belonging to the wealthiest slave owners feeling the most superior. Embracing such identification, known as identification with the aggressor, which embodies self-negation and self-hatred, is only one example of the contradictions which characterized the lives of slaves as they attempted to cope. We're talking about their struggles to make it. Such identification was a consequence of the fused master-slave relationship which slave masters forged in the attempt to stamp out African identity and to create a slave identity and to facilitate bonding to the master. During our research sojourn in Nigeria, we found people whose identity and sense of themselves was the very antithesis of such slave identity. We met the Oba of Ekeri Ikiti, who knew his lineage 30, that is 30 generations. Our research colleague, our Nigerian research colleague, Dr. Akinsola Akiwowo, told us an interesting story that demonstrates the importance assigned by the Yoruba people to the acquisition of a strong, clear identity even today. He said that when he was a boy and he had been disobedient, his mother chastised him by reading his oriki, which was a recitation of his relationship to his ancestors back through time. So she would say, "You are Akinsola Akiwowo, the son of Akilele Akiwowo, the son," and she'd make him sit there. But this blew my mind. The fact that chastising a child or socializing a child was done by enhancing the child's identity. And this was such an extreme contrast to what happened to the slaves when they came here and were known as Mr. Henry's gal and Miss Sophie's boy. And we also remember the story of Kunta Kinte, who lost his foot because he wanted to keep his identity. As I pondered these interrelated issues, I wondered, was identification with the aggressor an orientation that was adopted by my family? As I drove through Mississippi and saw the elaborate old antebellum homes, and that was really quite an experience to go to Mississippi alone to do this work and see all these Christian academies and whatnot, I was reminded of the family's passion for large houses. The awareness extended to the one in which I was reared and the one in which I now reside, even now. Another issue related to the family sense of entitlement was my mother Olli's outstanding beauty. All the family members and friends who were contacted never mentioned her name without reference to her beauty. I knew well enough how beautiful she was, for that had been a major issue in my battle for self-esteem. I also knew the pain it had brought her. for she had often shared with me incidents, very ugly incidents of rejection by others who envied both her beauty and her fair color. I learned about the source of some of her pain for the first time as I was informed by her brother Henry that when his mother and Ollie's mother Cecilia married his father Hippolyte Nelson, a dark-skinned man, his relatives so abused Olli that she was sent away from her beloved mother, grandmother, and family to stay with her aunt in a distant city. What I had known was that despite her unusual beauty, Mother was often sad and depressed. I knew this, and I said, I knew this well, for she was my first client, as she said, shared much of her sadness and depression with me. And I often wondered if by my becoming a parentified child, as the family therapists label it, and listening to her pain and perpetual mourning, I may have saved her from a breakdown. It can indeed be assumed that Ollie's color and fair skin did lead to rejection and loss of her mother, her father, friends, and family. Since I discovered, when I went back to St. James, that Adolphe Bourgeois lived in the family, in the community, and had a family, including other daughters, information shared by Miss Lavinia, and that everyone knew him as Ollie's father. She said, we used to say, there goes Ollie's father. So obviously she knew it. I have tried to imagine how Olli must have felt and been pained by the destructiveness of racism as it touched her life, abandoned by her father because she was not white enough, and abused by her stepfather, in-laws, and others because she was not dark enough. Her situation was poignantly tragic. She appeared to be the circuit breaker for the anxiety, hostility, and resentment of many persons in the systems in which she was trapped. Mother's reality, however, was that though she was envied and rejected by some, she was also admired and adored by many others. Her unusual beauty was both a curse and a blessing. Though sent away, she still remained special to her mother, grandmother, aunts, uncle, and siblings. Reared by her Aunt Carrie and husband, Reverend David Price, who was district superintendent of the Methodist Church, she had led a fairly privileged life, such as privilege was in those days. She was never the parenting oldest child to her younger siblings, as is usual in a large family, but she was rather the special idealized one, a role that can stabilize a family just as the role of scapegoat can. It became understandable that she so much enjoyed fairy tales. Cinderella was her favorite, and I speculated why that might have been. And she sent me messages that I was to achieve for her so she could live through me at the same time that I would be her therapist. This elitism and specialness, basic values in determining behavior in the family for 5 generations, entrapped me also and further reinforced the partially non-separate relationship that Mother and I had. I worked very hard to live up to her expectations. Another of Mother's favorite stories was Evangeline, the story of by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow of the French lovers in Nova Scotia who became tragically separated, and upon the abandonment of the French to Louisiana, were doomed to search for one another in vain. I only understood this after learning that my mother's father's family, the Bourgeois, were Acadian, the family having originally come from France to Nova Scotia, from which they were banished by the British. She never mentioned why this story meant so much to her, this story of loss and sadness, nor did she ever speak of how it felt to see her father, often knowing who he was, but to be unacknowledged by him. There were other possible sources of this expectation of entitlement. In hearing the various persons whom I contacted discuss the family back in St. James, I had confirmed for me the fact that Letty was the matriarch of the family. In my childhood, I had certainly both respected and feared her. In her role as the initiator, decision maker, and authority, she held the power in the family, while others were dependent on her and less able to exercise initiative. When all the power in any group is invested in one person, the relationship in terms of power is not very different from the relationship between master and slave. That relationships in the families of former slaves who identified strongly with their masters would be characterized by authoritative interaction and unequal power is understandable. And Letty's superior power did hold the family together, keeping it functioning in support of its members. The authoritarian nature of the relationships within the family can also be viewed in terms of the male-female dyad in Letty's generation. Letty had 2 children by white men who took no responsibility for them, and 2 granddaughters whose experience was the same. Her black husband, Alec Bibbs, helped to rear these white men's children, including helping to take care of the grandchildren. How did Bibbs feel under these circumstances, as was the lot of many black men? Did he feel exploited, overwhelmed, undermined as a man, or loving and protective of his wife's children and grandchildren? Perhaps both. Whatever his feelings, the power and the sense of entitlement had belonged to his wife. So in looking and taking a perspective on all this, I say, understanding my family's struggle to survive and thrive in the societal context of domination, oppression, mystification, and exploitation has been an act of liberation. It enabled me to understand residuals of the past that had reinforced the fragmented, often negative identity that has plagued African Americans. Through this experience, I was able to replace the shame, ignorance, and confusion that have surrounded my heritage with pride, knowledge, and understanding. As truly a transformative process, it has enabled me to achieve for myself a greater sense of integration and personal clarity. As I have shared this work, people's responses have been strong and immediate. They identify with different aspects: sadness, pain, anger, guilt. What are yours?